my name is Guillermo Rauch, and I'm the founder of Zeit and the co-creator of Next.js, the easiest way to create a React-powered website or application. I'm tuning in from California, and I'm really glad to virtually meet you. So today I'm going to talk about a topic that I'm really passionate about, which is creating websites and applications with React, but placing them at the edge so that you maximize performance, you maximize availability, all of this with the best possible developer experience. So at the end of this talk, you will have learned why it makes a lot of sense to put your sites and apps at the edge, why it makes so much sense to go global, how you can reach more audiences faster, and how you can do so with very, very little overhead on your side. And you're going to do so by learning how to architect applications and websites such that you can deploy them to the edge. So as developers, we really have one task at hand, and this is the manipulation and orchestration of information systems. In particular, what I mean by information systems is any physical system that involves the transmission of information over time and space. And just like any other system out there, it's governed by fundamental laws and chance. These fundamental laws have to do with the transmission of information, which, as you know, is not instant. So when you're talking to me or watching me now, we're conveying our information stream over time and space, and obviously that takes time. So on a very, very abstract way, our job has to do with this transmission of information from point A to point B. And point A tends to be a data source, and point B tends to be a human brain. So you can think of point A being a website, point B being me and going to that website. In other ways, you can think of more generally as me conveying an idea to you. But usually with the systems that we create, there's usually a stopgap. We push information somewhere, and then that information is later pulled by your users. And there are two fundamental mechanisms that we deal with as application developers that deal with these information systems on a day-to-day basis. One of them is push. So you might think of push in basically opposition to pull. So when you think about a system that pushes, you typically tend to think of a system such as a mobile phone that gets a push notification. And while this is a super fascinating pattern, it typically doesn't have to do with the kind of websites and apps that we create with React, obviously. When we're creating websites and applications, we typically are creating pull systems. And what I mean by this is we create a React-based UI, and then some user goes to that website and then pulls the information, right? So there's a discrete action that involves requesting a piece of information, and then I expect that data back to come to me as soon as possible. So in terms of the pattern that we thought about earlier is I'm going to get some data and want it in my brain as fast as possible. So the UIs that we're building and the applications and websites that we're building are increasingly more global. So when we think about the growth of the internet at large, and when we think especially about the relative growth, so the chart on the right-hand side is describing what happens year over year in terms of how many users are being added relative to the year before. And you're probably seeing now a lot of locations that are not particularly close to your home. Now that React Summit has gone online, we'll probably have some more, but these are probably not the places that you're expecting when you're, for example, writing or reading a tutorial on the internet and says, okay, I'm going to write my first application. Where is my next user likely to be? Well, increasingly, these are not always closer to home. And when we think about even e-commerce, I'm based in the US. React Summit was originally going to happen in Amsterdam. We think, okay, US and Europe, these are not necessarily places where e-commerce at large is growing with that kind of relative growth year over year. So we find Asia Pacific and Latin America. In terms of internet growth at large,
I'm having trouble hearing you.
we find that India added 100 million users in 2019, followed by China, actually then followed by the US, but then many other countries that we tend to not expect as obviously to be on this list. And in particular, the times that we're living in today with this pandemic have shown a very, very strong need for this instant connection, this instant information acquisition to happen. The winners of this pandemic have actually been those who have engineered with this global mindset uh, ahead of time. So much has been said about Zoom, for example, and how well they've scaled and how well they've performed when they've added or 10x or 100x their user bases very, very quickly over the past few months and years. And this is no coincidence because they thought about being global from the very beginning. So they operate data centers in many parts of the world, and their applications interface with data centers that are located automatically by the client application and optimize communication around that initial user location. So when we think about the patterns and when we think about the rules that I've already described, there's not much we can do about them, right? So there is the fundamental laws of the universe and how fast information can be transmitted over vacuum and over a wire. And then on the other hand, we have the rules of the global economy and the rules of this demand for more and faster global connection. So we have to play by these rules. We have to uh, accept them and adapt. So if we think about our job from that perspective, really is to transmit information as fast as possible. And I would say to spark joy at global scale. And I particularly added this because there are many ways in which we can mask latency and do interesting things with JavaScript on the client side and React to provide pleasant interactions that go beyond just a mere transmission of information. So I would be describing an incomplete model if I forgot to mention that techniques like animation and transitions and spinners and color and all ways that we can mask latency, those obviously help. So the task at hand is to deliver information quickly and do so in ways that are pleasant to people, and obviously respective of their privacy and of their needs and demands. So when I think about the tools that we have and how our tools have evolved, I've I would think that the most important thing is that our tools have adapted and evolved to consider these rules that of this global landscape that we just went over. So the tools have to adapt and rise to the challenge. And an interesting observation that I've made over time is that when you think about how we've been doing software development, it really does feel like we've been confined to a black box. So I would suggest that our challenge moving forward is to escape this black box. So start with why is this a black box? And the first black box like experience that I think about is our local development environment. So how do we develop software starts with an illusion. So we have localhost 3000. So anytime you sit down to develop an app, you boot up into this illusion, so to speak. So, and I mentioned that specifically because localhost is not a accurate metaphor for how this global internet and this global world and this global information transmission networks will play out. So it's a simulation that, for the vast majority of that experience, hides and runs away from this reality in some substantial ways. For example, obviously, we're dealing with one location. We're dealing with assets typically that are unoptimized. When you boot up your development server, whether it's Next.js or Create React App or Vue, you're basically booting up into a different reality. There's no SSL, which in some cases causes browsers to turn off features. There is no optimization or minification or uglification or compression of the code. The the different ways in which assets are loaded are not comparable to how they're going to be loaded in production. So this is kind of how this black box starts to begin with. So funny enough, we created these local dev servers, and then we kind of said, okay, so there has to be one way that we're going to represent our applications universally, right? So like if it runs on my computer, it should run somewhere else. And so kind of the best idea that we came up with is to ship the black box. So the black box, as it works in your machine, obviously it's not accurate to say that you're necessarily shipping your dev server. You're optimizing the assets a little bit, and they're saying, okay, run pretty much the same thing somewhere. I don't care. Just, here's the black. Especially when you're working with someone else, and like you're like, here's the deliverable. Here's my little server box. Let's ship it. And this is kind of where this metaphor starts showing some of the problems that we have, right? So typically, when we ship this box or container, server, whatever, we think of shipping it to one discrete location in the world. Okay, it's like, right, ship it to San Francisco. So the development lifecycle is being developed, built. In the process of building, interestingly, we produce lots of assets, and I'm gonna dive into these assets a little bit in a second because they're very, very important. We take the assets, we put them back into this, we assemble this box, and we ship it to San Francisco. And it means San Francisco because a lot of startups tend to just, start there and put their servers there. It could be Virginia, it could be somewhere else. And like I said, this idea of what the outputs of your application are tend to be very important, specifically the ones that are, just the basic fundamental primitives of the world, or the building blocks of the internet, which are HTML, JS, and CSS. Kind of following, or in some ways in parallel, but following this trend of, building this opaque black boxes or containers, a new idea started emerging in our industry, which is Jamstack. So Jamstack had this simple proposition that JAM, your site or app can be full static markup. So you can take that HTML and say, my site and all of its entry points are going to be that static markup. And then you take JS, but you run it on the client side. You don't run it in a way where in that particular location that you ship your code to, you're mediating the responses with that JS code, for example. No, you're assuming that the JS runs in what I call the true edge, which is ultimately the device. And then you call APIs from there. If you unwind a little bit, you're probably, and if you like zoom out and squint, you might think that there's kind of an interesting parallel here where Jamstack and the iOS development model kind of resemble each other, because when you download a native app, you're probably downloading it from the Android or iOS Edge kind of storage system. You're downloading some code, you're booting it up, and you're querying some APIs. So Jamstack kind of presented this new alternative for how to build kind of the same things. And one really interesting feature that I particularly think is very much worth paying attention to, and it relates to this idea of saving and shaving time, is that because you're shipping assets fundamentally, and your application is broken down into these assets, and as I mentioned, there's no server that intermediates the communication between your user and your application. A lot of the things that were being done just in time, like acquiring data and rendering HTML, that was being done just in time because you were going to a server. That server was going, getting some data, and it was outputting it to you. That was being done just in time. So what we've realized collectively is, well, is there an opportunity to do some of those things ahead of time? So the obvious idea there is, why don't you request the data at build time, inline it into the HTML, and ship it, so that then by the time the user comes to it, the data is already there. So it was done ahead of time. And what's of most interest is that we kind of are starting to remove this boxing step of the application delivery process. interestingly enough, the construction largely remains the same, right? So we develop, we build, we output HTML and CSS and JS and some server code that we can talk about how we can model that in this world. And then we ship it, but not to SF, we ship it to the world. And this is where shipping React apps to the edge becomes really, really interesting. So if we unwind a little bit and we think about what Next.js looked like 3 years ago, it kind of embraced this black box development model, right? Because you would run next build, and then that gave you that little package, that little box, and then you would start it up somewhere. And most likely, you would start it up in that cluster location region that you chose. And this kind of worked, right? Like you can say, well, there are ways that I can speed this up. There's ways that I can improve that fitness function that we talked about earlier of like, if I'm a visitor, I want to get the information as soon as possible. And that's by using a CDN, right? So like I can use a CDN, and that means that I can take some of the things out of that black box, and depending on like juggling headers and so on, put them at the edge. So my answer to that is that yes, to some extent we were able to do that, and I mean some of us were able to do that. Some of us would sometimes forget to do so, or configure headers and things like that. But there's still a fundamental disadvantage, right? So like you think of a CDN, and I represent it here with like different clouds, all the points of presence that it has globally, and then you think about your users coming and hitting those points of presence. When an asset is fresh, when you just rolled code, when something new was created, what would typically happen is um, you're hitting a cache, and that cache could have already evicted you, or might not have your asset, or because whether you just wrote code or for whatever reason. And then what happens is when this misses of this cache happen, we all go to this central location that we're deploying this black box to. And again, this is kind of still the best case scenario for this model, because this assumes that you did all the job, everything correctly, like setting all the cache control primitives, creating your purging pipeline, synchronizing everything, ensuring your CDN works perfectly. And what's interesting is, I started to collect experiences in which I go to a website on my phone or on my desktop, and it's and a website I would expect to be fully static. It is static. It looks static. It feels static. Sometimes it's just a marketing site, and I get these errors sometimes that say, bad gateway, or we could not communicate to the server. And I start thinking about like, what server? Why were you communicating to a server to begin with? And this is kind of where this like black box application model starts showing its limitations, right? So we have the issue of slow trips to home. We have the issue of potentially overloading your backend. We have the issue of the developer having to, communicate back all these cache control primitives. And then ultimately, we are not taking advantage of how we were building that application. And our framework is being conversely naive to all the interesting optimizations that we can do with modern cloud primitives. So Jamstack is not just about really how you were, what code you were using, but it's also this realization that, okay, if I can make parts of my application static that perhaps should be static, and what about even making your entire application static? So with Next.js, we looked at, the incredible potential that this could bring in terms of the developer not really having to think that much about, okay, I need to, Jamstackify or things like that. So we looked at ways that we could embrace this idea. And what we came up with is we already had a very powerful page-based application model. So for those of you who are familiar, you know that you create lots of pages inside a pages directory, and then those automatically map to routes, not unlike how kind of PHP works. And what's interesting is now we can kind of take each of these pages and we can say, how is the data being required for this page? And we can say, for example, no data is being required at the top level, like in this case, we can see with this top level page. And this, by the way, is kind of a mini version of what our website today, Zeit.co, looks like. First of all, it's all inside one repo. It allows me to share components across all my pages. My slash page is my home page, and I don't want that to ever be down or slow. Fully static, obviously. I have a function there, and that function needs to execute code on demand, definitely. So what does Next.js do if you're creating an API page, pages/API such as so.js, we export it as a serverless function or a Lambda function. Our dashboard, interestingly enough, is also static, but it's static in a way that feels very much dynamic because, again, we execute runtime JS code, we boot up, we issue effects with React hooks, and we get data. And interestingly, our blog is also static, but as I mentioned earlier, we made some ahead of time optimizations. So what we do is, for the dynamic path segment that you see there, post, we say, okay, data store, tell me all the posts that I have to generate with this, as you see on the bottom, get static paths hook. And then for blog itself, we say, okay, let's get static props at build time. At the end of the day, what do we get? We get a bunch of assets, mostly HTML pages, and also a function that can now be pushed to the edge. And by the way, static is only the artifact. As I said, you can boot up to JS on the client side that enhances these pages. So the black box is now open, and I can take these assets and place them strategically either next to my users or next to my data sources. No need to set headers. Again, if you look at the title of the presentation, I said, you can be performant, available, developer experience, pick 3. So as a result of this better architecture, the developer experience and the deployment and DevOps experience also improves because I don't need to configure anything. The static parts can be hoisted. The purging is automatic, and functions can be co-located next to data sources. And typically what happens as a result of adopting this architecture is that the actual maintenance and overhead that you have to do over the deployed artifacts is basically null because, again, your application is just this super stateless, super simple, super static asset set. So the artifacts are deployed to the right locations. The static ones can be replicated globally by our edge network. The functions can go to where they make sense to be in, right? In the prior iteration of the architecture that you could create, we're thinking of this local server that assumed the database has absolutely to be next to it, otherwise lots of branches will be slow. The static assets are also inside all that together with your code and your server code, your authorization code. So not only are we getting the flexibility now to co-locate code strategically next to data sources, but the static assets can be liberated and break out of that box. So as a result, we're gaining in so many different dimensions, right? We're reducing latency, we're improving availability, we reduce the single points of failure, we reduce the time that it takes to acquire these assets upon a cache miss from the global edge network, and we remove altogether the need to ensure that server unit or black box, how to scale, how to stay up, and so on. And the interesting thing about this is that we've done this kind of strategically in such a way that you can think of adopting this architecture one page at a time. So yeah, if you've tried or want to dig deeper into this, kind of the first step is you run create next app with npx. You'll get an index.js page that when you run next build just becomes static. And obviously the only contract required there is that you export React component. Then you can create pages that become more interesting, that have dynamic routes, even in the route in the URL, but also get data at build time. This is where you use the hooks, get static props and get static paths. And then you can even have functions that execute tiny bits of server code that can act as glue to existing backends or databases. And this ideally can be called from client-side.js from within those static pages that I mentioned earlier. And the contract there is very similar to what a Express endpoint would look like, where you get a request object and a response object. If you want to go step by step and learn more about this, I suggest you go to next.js.org/learn. And once you have that repository, or where you have your Next.js app, or even any other static or Jamstack app or framework, you can import it, and then deploying to the edge is as easy as running git push. And as I mentioned earlier, that illusion of just being constrained exclusively to localhost 3000 disappears, because what happens is you have your repository, and you can obviously develop locally while you're iterating, but what happens is after you push, because this Jamstack architecture is so lightweight, we can afford to take this static access, and kind of like every git push becomes its own accessible website that it gets exposed to the world. So those limitations of not being able to actually test what that thing that you're creating feels like in the real world environment kind of vanishes. You now get this URL that you can run performance tests against, lighthouse tests against, all kinds of stress tests against, and actually understand how it's going to perform in this real world scenario of being co-located at the edge. Thank you so much for bearing with me through this presentation. I'll be obviously following up with any question that you have. You can go to next.js.org/learn to learn how to develop these applications or websites, and then Zai.co to learn how to push them to the edge and deliver faster, better websites. Thank you so much.
Wow, Guillermo, thanks for that great talk. Really learned a lot from that. Yeah, super happy to have you here for our first Q&A session. So, hi.
Thank you. Really excited to be tuning in.
Yeah, you look a bit tired. You just woke up, probably.
It's super early in California.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, one question I have. You mentioned that there's a lot of progress since the 2017 version of Next.js.
Indeed.
If I can make an analogy, if a 2020 Next.js app hosted on site would be a Formula One car, what would you say a 2017 Next.js app would be?
That's a very apt metaphor. Mm-hmm. I do think just like a Formula One car, we've been working a lot on improving the engine. But also, just like Formula One cars, we're adapting to the rules of the environment constantly, right? I don't know how much you know about it, but the regulations and rules are constantly changing. So the environment is a very dynamic one. So you have to adapt the technology to this environment, right? And really what's happened is the environment has evolved, right? So in my talk, I was describing how the rules are kind of these global rules, right? And the expectations of developers nowadays have evolved with this environment as well. So with Jamstack, the demand has really become, let's optimize very, very strongly for the front-end experience. Whereas in the past, we were kind of being a little bit more holistic, more full stack, more server-oriented, right? So nowadays, the environment has really shifted towards, let's push content to the edge. Let's do more ahead of time rather than just in time. So I would say, it's my baby in some ways. So it's always been my number one Formula One car. But I would say that things have just gotten dramatically faster. And the very nice thing about Next.js is developers haven't really had to adapt their code much. A lot of the improvements have gone into that build process that we talked about, right? So it's like really driving a Formula One car that upgrades itself. So we've done all this work around, maintaining great backwards compatibility. So as long as developers are upgraded to Next.js 9, they're really getting our best engine ever, our best car ever.
Okay. So to sum up, it would basically be a 2017 Formula One car.
No, yeah, plus 3 years of improvement that you just like download from the cloud, basically.
Yeah,
which is pretty cool.
Well, thanks for the great work. I'm getting a question from Slack. For the people watching, you can still ask questions. We have a few minutes left, so if you have any questions, drop them in the Slack channel Q&A-React-track. There's a question from Ro. How does this compare to using a PWA? Then it's not just hosted at the edge; it's literally hosted on the device.
Great. That's a really great observation. Really, what we've always wanted to enable with the Next.js is React on the client side, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we would still be stuck in the past with like templates and server rendering and dropping a script tag and loading jQuery on the client side. So the spirit of Next.js has always been, hey, you can do some work ahead of time, like with static site generation and the build process. But really, it's all about enabling developers to do interesting things on the client side, right? We recently launched our SWR hooks for data fetching on the client side. So you can check it out, swr.now.sh. And Tanner is going to be talking about React Query. So Next.js has always allowed you to embed these components that are specifically designed for enabling experiences on the client side, enriching your websites on the client side. So where does PWA fit in all of this? So I would say PWAs do less of this ahead of time optimization. So you're not pre-building content. You're not building your blog or a marketing website necessarily as a PWA. PWA has really fit more the context of like, the Twitter client, where when you load it, you load into a splash screen, and then you're doing things that are very much on the client side of spectrum. And PWA is giving you features like service workers to really piggyback more on the device capabilities. But the really neat thing about Next.js is that it's always covered that spectrum. So the number of features from PWA that you want to take advantage of is really up to you. And I would say that the investment on what PWA features you're going to choose is going to be very domain specific. So some apps, it makes a ton of sense to add lots of PWA features. Some are more on the website spectrum. Next.js has always allowed you to create both, which is really great. A great example of adding a cool PWA feature to a Next.js website is adding notifications. So you create a blog and you want to push updates to your clients. You can use PWA features there as well. And I think I like this question a lot too, because I do think that what we're going to see a lot with Jamstack is this ability to transfer a lot of compute to what I call the true edge, which is the mobile device. So if you can do computation on the device, then that frees up resources that you could be doing on cloud, and also speeds up, you get a latency benefit as well, right? Because you're giving the client even more responsiveness. So
can be faster,
throughout 2020, we are going to be investing a lot in even deeper integration for PWA, Workbox, and other associated technologies like offline first websites into Next.js. So I really recommend staying on top of what's going to be announced.
Cool. Well, great answer. Thank you. The next question is from Andreas Roth. Somehow I feel that the persistence layer is still not up to these new Jamstack requirements. Am I only not update today here, or are solutions like FaunaDB or CosmoDB not as intuitive as services like Site or Netlify?
Yeah, I would say that's a good question. I think data layer is always a very, very tricky question. We've been talking a lot about, what data belongs on the client side, what data needs to be persisted directly on the device before it's synchronized to the cloud. There are patterns that are more fitted for backend oriented architectures where you just make a remote call and that backend interfaces directly with the database. I see this as a spectrum. So the easiest way to get advantages from a modern front-end framework like Next.js today truly is that there already exists an API, whether it's REST or GraphQL, and you're really modernizing your front-end layer, and then you're pushing that front-end layer to the edge. That's where I think I would say almost a low-hanging fruit of the internet is today. Because if you look at the past 10 years of software engineering, we have been working toward this separation between backend and frontend already. And again, that was driven a lot by the rise of mobile. So the rise of mobile meant, we're going to create native apps for a lot of companies, or even also the rise of the API as a service like Stripe and other companies, right? That meant that a lot of companies were already exposing APIs. They were modernizing their backend infrastructure through REST or GraphQL. So that creates an incredible opportunity for front-end developers that are watching, right? Because really you can take a framework like Next.js and you can completely overhaul your front-end experience. So you can modernize it with React components. You can implement design systems. You can make transitions really snappy because you're piggybacking on device capabilities. One of my favorite device capabilities that you can take advantage of with Next.js is the local in-memory cache, right? So the back button can be instant, transitions between pages can be instant. All that is enabled because Next.js is a very powerful, also client-side framework. So that's where the low-hanging fruit is, right? The backend already exists. I'm going to take over the front-end experience. I'm going to add PWA features. I'm going to add React components, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what the question is asking is, what are the opportunities to start going into the modernization of the backend as well? So I would say that today, Next.js is giving you a little bit of that, a taste of that future with functions, right? So we added built-in capabilities for defining serverless functions. So these serverless functions can act as a glue between those backends that maybe already exist and your front end. So it kind of is giving the front end developer this extra power, a little bit of more extra flexibility to really not be stuck waiting for backends to improve or file a Jira ticket to your backend team and so on and so forth to just get some new capabilities. So what does the future then look like for people that want to do more than just talking to existing backends and now talking to databases altogether? And that's what I would agree with the question that it's a little bit more tricky. And a lot depends on what the ideal database is for the problem domain that you're having, right? I do think we're going to see kind of broadly two trends there. One is GraphQL, where front-end developers feel very comfortable, right? Because it's very much optimized for their experience. And then we're going to see, I think, also databases that are more optimized for talking to functions directly, right? So we're starting to see AWS put out some products for optimizing, databases for connections with serverless functions. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. But I'll reiterate that I think really the power for the front-end developer comes in just owning the front-end experience and then try to push that to the edge so that the database doesn't really matter at that point.
Okay. Well, great answer. We have a few questions left, but unfortunately, we have no more time. So for the people that are asking questions in Slack, please go to the speaker room in Zoom with Guillermo. Guillermo, I would like to thank you for your time and enjoy the one-on-one talks with our attendees in the Zoom room.
For sure.
See you later.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.